Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Sue, for that generous introduction, and thank you all for coming here today. I want to begin by echoing Vice Principal Pierce's remarks about the land acknowledgement. I think that we need not only to make these land acknowledgements, but also to try to make them meaningful. So in honoring the meaning of this land to the people who have been and are indigenous to it, we need to think critically about the values we bring and the cultures we have brought in the past to this place, and to acknowledge that in many ways those values and those cultures have been, for those of us who are settlers here, have been very harmful, indeed really damaging to indigenous people on this land and to the land itself. And so it's in that spirit that actually I want to make some of my comments today. So the comments about humanizing education are in part to say we've often not humanized education. We've often not recognized the humanity of other people. And humanizing education is also about thinking not only about our relationship to other people, but also about our relationship to our environments and to the land. Okay, then I'd also like to say thank you again to CTL for inviting me to give this talk today. When I was invited, Sue explained to me the purpose of the day, which was to think about the whole person, to think about humanizing education, and I have to say that I was kind of humbled by that. And very humbled, because I am not actually, I haven't studied pedagogy. What you're getting is simply my reflections as somebody who thinks as a teacher about what I do as a teacher. So the other thing I should also add is that, as Sue mentioned, I am in a number of different departments, but I'm primarily a political theorist. And so none of you will get out of here today without learning something about political theory. It's just how I do the dance. So the format for today is, this is the big outline. First of all, I'm going to begin by situating my remarks for the day. I have a little story. I think it's important that you know a little bit about who I am and also about some of the background that I bring to these questions. And then the middle chunk, the larger chunk of the lecture, is going to be about what I think it means to humanize education, and this will be the interactive part. So I'd like to actually, before we even get there, ask you to look around at the person beside you or something and identify a person with whom you're going to do some exercises, because most of the interactive part is with one other person, okay? So you might as well lock eyes now and figure out who that is. Thank you. So for the interactive component to work, I'm always going to give you a time limit, and you're going to, with your partner, divide that time in half as best you can. And also pay attention, because we are on a tight schedule today, so I will only give you a certain amount of time, and then I'll be trying to interrupt you just like I just did now. And then the final part is not so interactive, and I just want to come back to some of my own reflections about why we do this, why humanize education. So here we go. When I was, this is the first part about situating these remarks. I have a story that's actually remarkably similar to John Pierce's story. When I was first given my TA responsibilities, I was in my early mid-20s, and I was both terrified and delighted. I was terrified mostly because of the fear that arose from thinking that I couldn't possibly know enough about my discipline to teach people. And so for the first year, every time I had to do a tutorial, I would immerse myself in the literature beforehand. I would just anticipate every possible question that somebody might ask me about political theory. And I think my focus was really on the content, on knowing the content really well. And I often think that you don't actually know something until you can teach it. And so it was a really good way for me to become better at my discipline, was to teach it and to feel that kind of fear. I was, as I said, also really delighted. I think I am excited by the things that I think about, and I wanted to share that with other people. Teaching was something that actually I really wanted to be good at, and I expect just because you're here today, I think that that's something that I'm assuming is true for the people here today. I still do care. It's been about, 40 years almost of teaching, and I still think that we as teachers should care about the content and that our students are able to learn that content. A lot of time in teaching is spent thinking precisely about how to convey content, how to prepare a syllabus that covers the content well, how to design assignments that will add to students' understanding of the material, how to create a class format, whether it is a lecture or online or blended or a seminar, in a way that actually will do justice to the material and that increases the likelihood that students will come away knowing more about that subject matter than they did when they started the course. But it's no secret that there's way more going on in teaching than just the sharing of content. I was aware right from the start that I was also teaching students and that it mattered both to me and to them that I acknowledge who they were, to the degree that the format of the class permitted and to the degree that I could structure it in a way that did that. So trying to figure out who was there not only made the teaching more interesting, but actually added to the meaningfulness of the content that I was trying to teach. At the same time as I was learning to teach, there I was in my mid-20s trying to figure this out. We didn't have a teaching development day, by the way. We just made this stuff up. So I was also immersed in early political theory, and you might have heard of Karl Marx. So Karl Marx was one of the people I was reading, and I was reading the 1844 economic and philosophic manuscripts of Karl Marx. 150 years after Marx had written these, I was immersed in them as I was trying to, and there was a line that I've written here that jumped off the page at me. Now, Marx himself was only 26 years old when he wrote the 1844 manuscripts. He was the age that many of you are, and he was writing something so profound that we're looking at it now. And he said, supposing we had produced as fully human. So if you know anything about Marx, you know that he's probably one of the leading critic of capitalism. And what Marx was saying in this passage was, there's something inhumane about capitalism. And it's a moment in his text where he steps away from his critique of capitalism and he says, supposing we did this differently, supposing we produced as fully human, instead of producing for profit, instead of producing out of our own self-interestedness in making profit, instead of driving wages down in order to ensure that the profit gets higher or expanding production or any of those things, supposing we produced as fully human. What would that mean? And Marx goes on in this, it's an incredibly romantic passage in which he talks about how when we produce, we're capable of, as humans, of investing ourselves in what we make. What we make becomes a reflection of ourselves. In my own teaching at this point, I would step aside and start talking about what a great pie maker I am. And I would talk about how much of myself I put into my pies. I also add a little Grand Marnier, just so you know. But how we also, in production, are responding to the humanity of the other, of the person for whom we are producing, and that in an ideal situation, people would be producing for each other out of the recognition of needs of humanity. We'd be producing for the needs of others and recognizing their humanity and putting our own humanity into it. So I was thinking about, for some reason, when I was asked to think about humanizing education, this phrase jumped into my head, supposing we taught as fully human. And I shifted it a little bit to say, imagine if we educated as fully human. What would that mean? So I'm asking you now, this is the first, now we're moving to the second part, the interactive part. Think about this. What does it mean to be fully human? What does it mean to be human? Okay, so what you're going to do is answer that question for yourselves. What I want you to do is create a bingo card. Okay, so if you have a piece of paper in front of you, or if you have a computer in front of you and you can just do this as a kind of quick grid, I want you to think of as many things as possible, ideally 9. You're going to create a little bingo card, and you and your partner, that person you locked eyes with, are going to fill it in. And you have 2 minutes to think of ways to fill this in. Okay. You may not have 9. Hopefully you have a couple. This apparently is a magic tool that when I launch it towards somebody, they will catch it, and it will, when you speak, other people in the room will be able to hear what you say. So I just want to hear a couple of the things. So maybe I'll toss it over here, somebody catch it, and tell me one of the attributes you think of being human. Then you toss it somewhere else. And we'll do this about 3 times, okay? Oops. Go ahead.
We got basic needs.
Basic needs. So humans have basic needs. Okay? Toss it that way, anywhere.
Be stewards of the environment.
Okay, so humans are responsible for our relationship to the land. Okay, toss it back behind you somewhere. Excellent.
Feelings.
Humans have feelings. Excellent. Okay, can you toss it back to me, please? Oh. Okay, add another one to it.
Humans have goals.
Humans have goals. Yes, we have aspirations and things towards which we work. So the reason for doing this and for stepping back for a moment is obviously to think about when we're going to say, what does it mean to teach as fully human? Fill in your grid, and you might have put things you can add. If you have spaces on your grid, you can add everything that people have just said, or some of the things that I might have myself put on a grid. We have needs. Maybe that's a way of saying we're physical. We have physical needs. We have things that are important to us. We have a relationship to the environment. I think that we live within an environment for which at least we should take responsibility. The should might mean we're also people capable of having morals and so forth. So think about those things. And then the question is, how do we address these human attributes in our teaching? And I think there's no one answer to how to do this, because how you do this is going to depend on what you're teaching. But just to give you some, this is your homework. Okay, we're not going to do this here. Some of the exercises we're going to do here, I have 2 pieces of homework for you. So one of your pieces of homework is when you leave here and go home and reflect about your teaching, think about the ways in which you could incorporate some of these things into your teaching. Basic needs, for example, is one where you might want to think about what the needs of your students are. Perhaps we're physical beings. Perhaps we have a need to get up and move sometimes. That's something you can build into your teaching. You can actually ask students to shift spaces in the room. One of my best seminars, I get everybody up on their feet and having one-on-one discussions about one of the concepts, actually about all of the concepts we're dealing with. So if you think people are creative, you can try lesson plans in which students are encouraged to draw representations of things or to act things out or to be dramatic. You can think about what it means to be human and try to think about how to put that into your teaching. I'm just going to guess here that I have other things that may not be on your list. Some of these might make it on your list, some of them aren't. If you get all 4 of the following things on your list, then you win. Okay, so your bingo card is a little bit of a test here. But I want to introduce some things that I've thought about and that are reflected in the kind of theoretical work that I do that you might not have thought about in terms of how we approach teaching. And so I have 4, and there's going to be little exercises related to 3 of those 4. Before I do it, I want you to think about one fact that you are interested in that you might teach someone. okay? So, it has to be something that you think is somewhat important, but think of one fact. You know, if you were a physicist, for example, you might think, oh, there's more matter than antimatter in the universe. That's kind of interesting. And it might be something that as a physicist, you might need to teach somebody. If you were a political scientist, you might need to teach somebody a fact about the way in which power is defined. You know, so think about your fact. And we'll just leave it there for now. You have it in your head, because you're going to be teaching that fact today. So get a good, but it has to be a short fact, okay? So the first thing I'm going to suggest, there you go. Actually, wait to tell it to your partner just because of the timing situation. You're going to have a chance to tell it a couple of different ways. When you tell your partner your fact, I want you to listen very carefully while they tell you their fact. Okay? So we're both learning and teaching today, which is normal. We are limited. That's the first thing that I want to say. That maybe, did anybody have that? You did, James. Great. Okay. So we are limited is a fact about who we are. We are limited because we are human. Because we are human, for example, we have 5 senses, maybe more, but there's limitations to what we can perceive. Other creatures can perceive things far different from us. We're limited also because we live in a particular time and in a particular place. We are at a moment in history, and that makes certain kinds of knowledge available to us that wasn't available to our predecessors, and what we know now may not always be true or be known by other people. And so we are limited, and we can think about how that affects how we teach. So no matter how brilliant you are, no matter how many times you cram political theory before you go into your seminar, or learn about teaching writing before you teach writing, or learn about astrophysics, you are never going to know everything. And so think about that in terms of how you incorporate that awareness of the limitedness of who we are into your teaching. Some of the things that I think it allows us to do is to be humble. I think too often teaching can become a profession in which there's a kind of an arrogance, a way of saying, I know this and you don't, you know, like of trying to not show the students also how your own knowledge has its limitations. It's refreshing when a teacher just says, I don't know, let's find out, as an answer to a question, or I'll get back to you about that. So don't feel, especially as new teachers, that you have to know everything. In fact, trying to be aware of the ways in which your knowledge is limited and to be honest about that is important. I said also that there would be moments here where I would talk about political theory. This is one of them. Many critical political theorists really question, and I'm talking about indigenous political theory, as referred to in the land acknowledgement at the beginning. I'm talking about feminist political theory. I'm talking about much critical and anti-racist political theory, are very critical of the way in which the West has assumed that because we as humans are creatures who acquire knowledge, who learn about things, that makes us more important than those things themselves. That because we learn about the way synapses work in the brain or the way in which different species exist on the planet, that makes us superior to those species. And that kind of hubris actually gets in the way of knowledge. So there has to be, according to those other critical ways of thinking, a way of acknowledging how limited we are, that we are a part of the world, not greater than the world, that we are one species among many species. So now I want you to do, oh, sorry, I missed all my little points, that we're context bound, that we're sitting in time and place, that there are implications of this, and that this should affect our attitude. Okay, so those are all things I said. Getting ahead of my PowerPoint actually is not a bad thing, okay? PowerPoint, one of the evils of our time, but necessary when, I so prefer the Blackboard, but it is hard for people at the back to read, and almost impossible now for anybody to read my handwriting. So here's your first exercise. That fact that you have, I want you to tell it to the person beside you or the person you are talking with, but tell them in a way where you acknowledge something about the limitations of your knowledge or the limitations of your field, okay? And just take a minute to tell the person and a minute to listen to what they have to say. Okay, your go. Okay, you can start to wrap up. Okay, thank you. I'm not going to collect your observations now about that, but I think I'd like you to reflect either now or later about how differently you conveyed that material after that bit of instruction than you might have if I had just had you convey it the first time, right? That one of the things we need to be able to do, and I think it actually frees our students up to also acknowledge their own limitations. So that's the first thing. The second quality that I think makes us human, and this is one that many of you might have actually had on your list, is that we are meaning-seeking. What do I mean by this? I mean that in the course of our lives, who we are informs what we know and vice versa. That we seek meaning in the world that we live in, and that things and other people and places and ideas become meaningful to us, and that it is something that will enhance your teaching immensely if you think that through. So just as an example, think about the way in which an object, any object in your life, has become meaningful to you. Maybe it became meaningful because somebody important to you gave it to you. Or maybe you have a place in your life that's very meaningful because of experiences you had there. Or maybe your research is really meaningful to you because you can imagine the impact that it could have on people's lives. Or within the discipline, how much it could change some of the debates that are taking place. We can imagine how things take on certain kinds of meanings because, and when they do, we invest ourselves in those things and they become part of who we are. So it is hard, very hard now, for me to imagine who I am without also imagining the kind of knowledge that I carry around, the thoughts that are in my head, the ideas, and the stories that I would tell you about them. So those stories include, for example, why and how the quotation from Marx at the beginning had an impact on me to help me to think through some of the things that were important to me in being able to think critically but also imaginatively at the same time. So I'm telling you something that is meaningful about a fact that I gave you. Marx said this, it's meaningful to me, Eleanor MacDonald, because of certain things. So now, we have to do this part. We often tell these things in terms of stories, that they affect our identities, that often they include things like memories. Memories are often meaningful, that they often include feelings. This addresses the comment from the person earlier that part of humanizing people is thinking about their emotions. So here's your second exercise. Why or how, let's work with the same fact, why is it meaningful to you? And before you get going on it, I want you, part of this is to explain the importance or meaningfulness of the fact to your partner, but I also want you to listen really carefully when your partner tells you what makes their fact meaningful to them. Okay? You have 3 minutes. Go. At this point, you should have in your head not only what your own fact is, but you now have some important knowledge that you didn't have before. And that knowledge leads to the third thing that I want you to think about, which is our capacity to relate to other people. Okay, so we have a capacity, wrong doohickey. Here we are. For being relational. And again, some of you may have had this in your bingo list. The recognition that we have the capacity to put ourselves inside another person's framework of reference. That something in the story that you were just told you something important about that person. And so obviously the word empathy is often used in relation to something where you're empathizing with somebody's pain or somebody's difficulty. But empathy is part of human connection. It's the capacity to think about how somebody else experiences the world and what is meaningful to them. And so this is the third and final of these exercises. I want you we're capable of sharing meanings, we're capable of empathy, we're capable of positioning ourselves inside someone else's framework. Now, the thing I'm going to ask you to do here is quite difficult, and that is to think again about your fact, the one you taught the person before, but now tell it to them again the third time, and this time I want you to try telling it to them in a way that you think will appeal to the framework of reference or the meaningfulness that they gave to their own fact. It's hard. But just to give you an example, before, hold on just a second. Just before you get going, what I told you about myself and my fact told you something about me. It told you that I'm a person who actually needs some optimism in my life, right? I needed to have in the immersion of my study of capitalism as a political theorist, I needed to have something that made me feel better, right? I need to have something, a reason for optimism. Things appeal to me that appeal to my imagination, right? That, I also told you that as part of my story about Marx and why that particular quotation was important. I told you perhaps the ways in which that other vision of the world was important to me, in part because it involved a more optimistic or benign view of humanity. So you could pull on that. So although it seems like a very difficult thing to do, you don't have to do it exactly. You just have to think about something that the other person told you that might be a hook into their framework of reference. Okay, so I know this is really hard. Last exercise, then we'll get to the conclusion, or almost the conclusion. But we'll again just do 2 or 3 minutes and try, 3 minutes, and try to convey your fact again, but this time try and see how you can make it more appealing to the other person, to their framework of reference. Okay, go. All right, so you can see what I'm trying to do here. The point is not, your teaching will become way more meaningful to everyone if you talk about why it's meaningful to you. But it'll become really way more meaningful to everyone if you can figure out what makes things meaningful to your class. So what are some ways you can do this? One of them is to ask them, what makes this meaningful to you? One of them is, for example, in a seminar situation or tutorial or something, to have a little go around the room and say, what interested you in the readings this week? Or what part of that did you find the most exciting? What appealed to, are there authors that you find yourself more confused by or troubled by? Like, what is, in other words, the framework of reference of the people who you are teaching? So other things you can do is get your students into smaller groups and have them share that information and report back, because one of the things I've also learned about teaching is that while we're teaching individuals, we're also teaching classes, and different classes will amongst themselves become a community that also has interests. Moving along, I have one more thing on the bingo card, and that is that we are vulnerable. And one of the things that makes us super vulnerable is not just that we are physical people with needs, that we're mortal, that we can be ill and tired and all of those things, but also that we are relational and that we care. We care about what other people think about us. We care about other people's views and perceptions of us. We seek to be recognized. And this is something that, even though we might want to deny it, it is a fact of what it seems to be a fact of what it means to be human. The implications of this for teaching should be clear enough. In order for vulnerability to be taken into account, you must become trustworthy. You must become worthy of the trust of your students, and you must indicate to them why you are. So the things you can do, the things you probably already are thinking about doing, is being transparent about, for example, how you will be fair in your grading, being transparent about how you will evaluate something if you have to evaluate something like participation, being also conscious of the boundaries of your professionalism. So one of the things you will learn about is that you are in a professional role. You have actually been institutionally given power over other people. So the relationship is not an egalitarian relationship. It's not this beautiful mutual relationship that Marx was talking about at the beginning. It's a relationship in which you have responsibility for teaching other people and doing it in a way which addresses, which acknowledges that you actually have power over them. They are right to feel vulnerable in your presence, and you need to take the measures that you could take to ensure that you develop trust. And I think it's worth reflecting on that before we get to our homework assignment, which is about trust. You also might want to think about some of the ways in which we deny our vulnerability and fear. The emphasis, for example, in our culture on social bonds, on fitting in, on going with the flow. People are so afraid that they won't be treated as who they are, recognize that they fit in with the crowd. It's better to at least feel like you have strength in numbers. And so we have a lot of things happening on campus right now to create those social bonds. One of the things we need to think about is the way in which people's individuality and their need for recognition as who they are, not as a member of such and such a group, can get destroyed or dissolved in those kinds of exercises. And your classroom should be a place where people learn to think for themselves. Yes, they learn your discipline, but they also learn to think for themselves. But in order to be able to do that, and in order to be able to develop intellectual autonomy, the capacity to think for yourselves, and moral autonomy, the capacity to make decisions that feel right and that are in accord with your value system, you need to create classrooms in which people are respected as individuals. And so our need to relationships to others makes us vulnerable. Institutional relationships of power increase that vulnerability. There is a risk that people lose themselves in an effort to belong. There's a risk in our culture of denial of vulnerability. Think about the number of films or movies or just cultural references to being tough, to surviving, to being strong, to not showing emotions. And the importance of developing relationships of trust and the importance of respect for moral autonomy. And I think our classrooms, no matter what we're teaching, are places where we can think about how to cultivate that. And so I don't have a cute little exercise in which to develop trust in this moment. Shock, but I have my limitations, as I told you. But your homework is to think about ways in your teaching to develop your students' trust in you. And so to encourage the students' autonomy, I would say also to acknowledge your own vulnerability as part of that, and to ensure that you are treating students equitably and fairly. And I encourage you to take those sessions today, take all the sessions today if you could, but to take sessions which also treat you how to create a comfortable learning environment for diverse people and for an equitable learning environment and an inclusive learning environment. Okay? So I'm going to wrap up now with my own observations on why we do this and why humanize the classroom. Oh, sorry. First of all, did anybody win? Did anybody get all my 4? Darn. Okay. Next time. Okay. But I want to come back to that also to say that everything you thought of too is also important. I just wanted to add these things in as ones that you might not have thought of. And in a way, the fact that nobody got all 4 tells me that I was a little bit useful today. Okay? So why humanize teaching? Well, one reason would be for the sake of the content itself. There might be evidence out there, it would make sense to me if there were evidence out there that said that people learn better in an environment in which they're humanized. People learn better when they learn the limitations of the knowledge. They might learn better when that knowledge is attached to meanings or addressed to them in their meaning framework. The teaching, therefore, will work. The students will learn more than they would have otherwise. But will they? I don't know, because I haven't done that work. I don't know. Other people who study pedagogy can tell you whether or not that's a reason to do this. It might be. So it's a good bet, right? Better than 50-50, I would say. Bet that this is a reasonably good way to do the thing that we think we're doing at the beginning. Transmission of content. Okay. A second reason to do this might be, my slide is, for the sake of the students themselves, because you're committed to your students. We actually live in an era right now where there's a lot of attention to the group of people that we're teaching. There's a lot of concern for how they are. The newspapers are full, I still read newspapers, of advice about your going to university and how to manage stress. There is a concern that is reasonable because of the kind of world that has been created for them, a world in which work is increasingly precarious, that people are worried about technology taking over their jobs, that they're worried about losing the planet, that they're worried about impending catastrophes and crises. We care about these people, and it might make sense, and it's a good reason to humanize the classroom. But do students want this? I just want to throw a note of caution in here. In my experience, students don't always want this. Sometimes students, they've been trained in this culture. They don't actually want to confess what they don't know. They actually may not find it all that appealing when you say what you don't know. They might take advantage of your efforts to create bases of trust. There is a phenomena that I want to spend more time thinking about, but that I have experienced in the classroom, which I call resistance to learning, where students actually don't want to learn. They want to know what's on the test so they can memorize it and do well, and then go on and do something that they think is more important, like go out and make network, make friends who will be useful to them in their career. That there's ways in which this whole emphasis that I'm placing here on humanizing the classroom may not, in fact, reflect the values of our culture very well. So students often are trained from early on to please the instructor, so they'll do this, but only because they think you want it, and not because they're actually being affected in the ways that you would hope. This resistance to learning. Also, as you discovered in those exercises, trust is hard. Empathy is hard. It's hard to do, like trying to put yourself in some other. So there's reasons why students may not take to this. There is, as I say, in many ways, this approach is not reflected in our culture, and that is actually the main reason why I think we should be doing this. So the main reason is for the sake of the larger society and the larger environment in which we live. The purpose of education might be to transmit content, and it might be to make this a nice place for our students, but the actual purpose of education probably should be to think about what our larger society needs and the kinds of citizens and people that we are creating to live in that society and take care of, to come back to the earlier point, that environment. The purpose of education is for a better society, what kind of world we want to produce. So I want to conclude with just reference to another theorist. This person is Theodor Adorno, and he's probably the person I've spent the most time thinking about in the last year. Some of you may know him. Oops, I just turned on the lights. Enlightenment. We can just leave them on. Theodor Adorno was a refugee from Germany in the 1930s. He fled to the United States, as did the other members of the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt, where he worked. And when he came back to Germany afterwards, he wrote a radio play called, not radio play, a radio lecture called Education After Auschwitz, which you might want to read someday. In that lecture, the opening line of that lecture is, the premier demand on all education is to prevent Auschwitz from ever happening again. Why? Obvious. We don't even need to answer that question. But in that essay, Adorno analyzes what were the aspects of German culture at that time. Hitler was elected. Germany was the most literate society in the world at that time. Germany prided itself on how elevated its culture was. What was it in that culture that allowed this to happen? And in that essay, Adorno speculates that it's features that I've been referring to here, a hardness that had developed, the notion that education should be about toughening people up, the kind of values in our culture that treat people as a means to get somewhere instead of as an end in themselves, that treat connections with other people instead of being for that person because of that person's intrinsic value to you, being about networking and getting ahead. Adorno also talks about a kind of fascination, mesmerization with technology and how we can lose sight of the real reasons why we have technology, which is to create a better society, and think about that as opposed to think about the value of technology in and of itself. Adorno emphasizes in this essay the importance of critical thinking, the importance of reflecting on the ways in which our knowledge is situated in society and the ways in which we can advance society only through thinking critically about what it is that we do. So, as educators, we are responsible for the content for our students and also to the larger society. We're responsible for getting the content right, for having knowledge of it to the degree that we can. We're responsible to our students primarily for being trustworthy, for respecting them, and for trying to develop them and their ideas, and for imparting knowledge to them in a way that responds to what's meaningful to them. But we're also primarily, I think, responsible to this world we live in and to that environment, and for which we need, I think, a greater degree of critical thinking and classroom environments that support that. Thanks very much.